Ever wonder what goes into a marriage vow beyond just saying, I do? Well, today we're going to explore a really detailed template for Muslim marriage vows to get a better sense of the intricate promises and commitments that go into creating a partnership that's both spiritual and legal.
All right, let's just dive right into this. Every single marriage rite, no matter the culture, it's built on a set of promises. But what do those promises actually look like when they're spelled out in explicit detail? What happens when a marriage contract is also a deeply spiritual covenant? Now, I want to be super clear right from the get-go. We are looking at one specific template. This comes from an article by a life coach, Coach DeBruins. So this is his interpretation of what default vows could look like, and it's all designed to clarify the rights and obligations for a couple. So here's our game plan for this breakdown. First, we'll look at the template's overall structure. Then we'll dive into the shared vow that sits right at its core, before exploring the specific pledges for the husband and then the wife. We'll even see how it accounts for parting ways before we land on the ultimate weight these vows really carry. Okay, first up, the template itself. And you can pretty much forget simple romantic sentiment here. The source presents this as a detailed contractual framework. It's designed to clearly lay out the rights and obligations for both partners right from the very start.
So where does it all begin? With something called the shared foundation. According to this template, before any promises are made to each other, there's a core principle that first unites both partners with a higher purpose. And what's really interesting here is the priority. See, the very first vow isn't to each other. It's a shared pledge to a higher authority. Both the man and woman promise to uphold the commands of Allah and follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad. This immediately frames the entire marriage as an act of worship. And if you're wondering about the reasoning behind that, the source points to this specific Quranic verse, 4:59, as the basis for this foundational vow. The logic presented is that any pledge made by a Muslim has to be rooted first and foremost in obedience to God. Okay, so with that spiritual foundation set, the template then moves into the specific roles. Let's start with the husband's pledges and see what responsibilities are outlined for him. The source groups his vows into three key areas. First, you've got his material and protective duties. Second, it's all about his personal conduct and kindness towards his wife. And third, his commitment to fidelity and confidentiality. So diving into that first category, provision and protection, the pledge is very direct. The husband vows to take care of his wife to the best of his ability by providing her with the essentials, we're talking food, clothing, and shelter, and to actively protect her from harm. And this is so crucial. The part on conduct goes way beyond just material support. This template includes vows to live with his wife on equitable terms, to be patient during difficult times, and this is key, to guard her secrets and cover her shortcomings. It's really a pledge of deep emotional and psychological support. Okay, so now let's turn to the other side of the contract. We're on to the wife's pledges, outlining the commitments specified for her in this template. And similar to the husband's section, her vows are also categorized. We have pledges related to devotion and personal modesty, promises about maintaining marital boundaries, and then commitments regarding trust and deference in the relationship. So let's look at devotion and modesty. The template includes vows for her to be, and this is a quote, devoutly obedient, and to guard her chastity. It also specifies lowering her gaze and adhering to modest dress and conduct. Within this interpretation, these are all framed as integral parts of her marital commitment. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because we see a direct parallel. Remember the husband's vow to guard his wife's secrets? Well, the wife makes a corresponding pledge, not to publicize his private affairs or share his secrets. This really highlights a shared mutual responsibility for confidentiality within the marriage. This template also addresses the topic of polygyny. It specifies that a wife cannot, within this contractual framework, forbid her husband from taking other wives, because that would be seen as prohibiting something religiously permissible. However, and this is a big however, it explicitly states she can contractually reserve the right to initiate a divorce if he does marry again. And here's the direct explanation from the source article to clarify that point. The logic presented is that a contract cannot make something unlawful that is considered lawful in the religion. So the contractual power that's given to the wife is the option to exit the marriage, rather than the power to forbid the act itself. You know, a really striking feature of this template is its foresight. It doesn't just focus on the beginning of the marriage, but also on its potential end. This next section covers the promises made for parting ways, whether that's through divorce or death. This table lays it out pretty clearly. For a divorce, the husband pledges to part without animosity. The wife pledges to honor the edda, which is a religiously prescribed waiting period before she can remarry. And crucially, they both promise to maintain the family relationships that were created by the marriage, recognizing that those bonds can and should persist. And in the case of death, the template includes a specific vow for the wife. Based on a Quranic verse that's cited in the source, she pledges to observe a waiting period of 4 months and 10 days before she can remarry. The vows also extend to financial matters after death, with both partners pledging to honor Islamic inheritance shares. This chart shows you how it works, based on verses cited in the source, and you'll notice the shares really depend on whether the couple has children. For example, a husband would inherit half of his wife's estate if they have no children, but that share becomes 1/4 if they do. On the other side, a wife or wives collectively would inherit 1/8 of the husband's estate if there is a child. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most powerful part of the template, the weight of a vow. This is the final declaration that seals all of the promises that came before. After laying out all these detailed rights and responsibilities, the contract concludes with this simple yet incredibly profound statement. This here we promise and call Allah to witness. It just transforms the entire document from a simple agreement into a sacred testimony. And all of that leaves us with a final question to consider. Regardless of your faith or background, it's worth thinking about. How does having such a detailed, explicit marital contract, covering everything from kindness to inheritance, shape the actual lived experience of a relationship? What gets gained and what might be lost when love is also a comprehensive legal and spiritual pledge?